Kia tau te rangamari e o te rangi e tū nei, o papatua anuku e takoto nei, o te taio e awhinei ki rungi e tātou. Ti hei mauri ora. Look, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today. I want to thank Peter Berg and the whole team for putting this on and for inviting me to be a part of it as well. My main regret is that I'm unable to spend the whole day with you because this is pretty much the crowd of people who I need to spend most of my time with, and just the nature of the job means that I'm unable to. So if you could sort it out, that'd be great. Let us know what you come up with, and then we'll pass some legislation. Any questions? Yeah, I can see my officials freaking out in the front row. So we need a heap of trees, and I mean a heap. The reason for that is we've got, certainly in the kind of climate change world, we need to draw as much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as is already up there and store it for as long as we possibly can. And I'll get kind of into the details of that in a minute. But, you know, our nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement calls for us to remove or reduce our emissions by 150 million tonnes below projections over the next 7 years, right? Now, for context, we put up about 80 million tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year, and we take down about another 20 through forests, roughly, right? So we're kind of sitting on, you know, about a net 60 million, give or take, every year. So the idea of cutting 150 million tonnes out of our profile in the 7 years remaining to us of this decade is an extraordinary challenge. We need a heap of trees, a heap. The emissions budgets that the Commission advised us on, which we actually beefed up slightly, but agreed in Parliament earlier this year, caters for about 50 million of that, right? And the Commission were making some reasonably conservative judgment calls. They said, you know, we're not going to factor in any kind of new technology that might be in the lab, but it's not yet commercialised. It's pretty much only what's already out there and so on. And, you know, took into account essentially how long they thought it could take different sectors to change and so on. And they said they think that reasonably we should be able to get about 50 million tonnes out of our profile by 2030. So that means that we're about 100 million tonnes short between what the Commission recommended or thought that we would be able to do domestically, pulling pretty much every lever that they felt that we had available to us, and what we need to do. And nobody in particular wants to go offshore for that. But we know that we are likely to because we've only given ourselves 7 years to perform that reasonably Herculean task. And so even if you said, well, we're going to pull all of those levers domestically, we still need to find another 100 million tonnes. Cabinet has said that our highest priority for meeting the nationally determined contribution is domestic inward investment rather than international, right? So that's the top priority. To the extent that we can't find it onshore, we will go offshore. We'll work with countries primarily in the Asia-Pacific region in ways that support their sustainable development goals, so we can kind of get some developmental benefits out of cooperating with other countries, which is a very good thing, and we'll do that largely through bilateral arrangements. And then the third priority beyond that is, you know, kind of hooking into other credible carbon markets, you know, in jurisdictions where we actually feel they've got the credibility. But if you go back to that first priority and said, well, okay, so if you pull all of the levers that you think that you can pull and you get 50 million, but then you want to go beyond that, well, where do you look? We need a heap of trees. So that's kind of my opening context. in order to sequester the amount of CO2 that we need to sequester in the time that we've got available to us, we need to get planting. The other thing that I want to say is that's not the only reason why we need them, obviously, right? So I have one of the hats that I wear is an Associate Environment Minister for biodiversity. So I'm essentially supporting the Minister of Conservation in the rollout of the Aotearoa New Zealand Biodiversity Strategy with a regulatory tool called the National Policy Statement, which sits under the Resource Management Act, which we've actually been trying to get successively through Parliament over the course of the last 20 years, I think, was the first attempt to get that through the government. And so we know that restoring our Indigenous biodiversity and kind of the vast swathes of land, especially the most erosion-prone, steep and remote parts of our country, much of it in Māori ownership, much of it it should just never have been deforested in the first place, right? It was just a terribly, terribly bad idea. And so the question is, well, what can we do to help to restore that? We also need wood. You might have noticed we're kind of short of houses. How that happens in a country with as few people and as much land and as much wood as we've got, still can't quite work that out, but there we go. So we need wood for houses. We need it for bioplastics and biofuels to replace all those fossil plastics and fossil fuels and so on and so on. We need a heap of trees, right? And we need all kinds of trees, right? And we need fast-growing, we need slow-growing, permanent forests, and so on as well. So that's my kind of starter for 10. If anybody's in any doubt where I stand in relation to forests and trees, we want lots of them. So that kind of drives a lot of my work program. The next thing that I just wanted to talk about is around the emissions trading scheme. Which I know many of you are participants in or observers of. And I want to start this piece of context as well by just saying, look, the emissions trading scheme is a small component, or deals with a small component of that 150 million tonnes, right? The emissions trading scheme essentially deals with a subset of our domestic emissions budgets, which are themselves a subset of our total effort that we need. So I know we spend a lot of time talking about the ETS, and there are things that we need to fix about the emissions trading scheme, clearly. But actually there's a much bigger picture that we need to be paying attention to here, which is outside the realm of the ETS as well. So I just want to place the whole kind of forestry and policy kind of piece in terms of climate there. So the Commission in May of last year, so about 18 months ago, gave us some fairly strong advice about future settings for the emissions trading scheme. They were worried about the potential for essentially an imbalance between the kind of supply of forestry offset units coming into the ETS and the possibility that we could end up in a situation not too dissimilar to where we were the last 10 years, where you could find yourself in a situation where the price NZUs came down and polluting companies, sort of started to put more of their effort back into forestry offsets than into reducing their emissions. They said we needed several 100,000 hectares of fast-growing exotic carbon sinks sort of for the next kind of 30 years, but then also beyond that we need another several 100,000 hectares of permanent native forests to act as long-term permanent carbon sinks as well. And so that was in their advice. We're dealing with components of that, some of which are maturing at the moment, some of which we'll deal with next year and the year after. But again, when they issued their more recent advice on ETS unit supply settings, they once again kind of said, look, you really need to deal with this. And so we will be taking a look at that. We don't have to do it in a huge hurry. They've said by the end of 2024, we need to have kind of dealt with the extent to which we think that there is a real problem there. There may not be a real problem there, but we have to deal with the question of whether there is a real problem there, and if there is, then what are the things that we might deal with that. Earlier this year, famously, we released a proposal around changes to the permanent forest category. I know Stu talked a little bit about that when he was here earlier, and we're now in a process of trying to work out, well, what are the changes that we might make to that to make that work. And a subset of that, which is something that I am primarily responsible for, which is the National Environmental Standard for plantation forests. Because we've got a kind of slightly weird situation where if you have a plantation forest that you're planning to harvest, there's a regulatory setting for that. If you've got a forest that you've planted, but it's not for harvest, there isn't a regulatory environment for that to deal with the environmental effects and how we manage those and so on. And what we're trying to do is to work through a process where you say, well, how do we shape those environmental regulations in a way that actually really enhances the not just the environmental outcomes we want, but also the kind of social and economic outcomes, and how do we use that as a way of supporting the industry to grow and develop as well. Now, all of that kind of, so I know you'll have lots of questions about that, so I'll kind of skip over that. The last thing that I just wanted to deal with before we turn it over to questions is around the issue of sequestration. And what the future holds for it, because I'm actually really excited about it. One of the things that's gotten lost in the debate around He Waka Eka Noa, the agricultural emissions pricing scheme, most facts have gotten lost in the debate about that, by the way. But one of the facts that is absent is around what our intentions are to do with sequestration. So the He Waka Eka Noa partnership gave us a proposal, and they said, look, there's all these kind of categories of vegetation that sequester carbon dioxide, and they're not in the emissions trading scheme, and they, all take place in one form or another on farms, whether you're talking about riparian strips or you're talking about wetlands or mangroves or whatever it is. Why can't that count, right? Because scientifically, it does actually draw down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and they actually said to us, wouldn't it be great if that should really be in the ETS alongside forests, right? But given that it's not, how about we just set up a system to deal with it in parallel through the He Waka Eka Noa proposal? The Commission had some pretty strong reaction to that, so we're trying to work our way through that. But the Commission also said all scientifically valid forms of sequestration should be in the ETS, right? And this is something that I have also been saying largely to the stars for the last 5 years. And we're making some progress on this now. So what we're proposing to do kind of is the link between the ETS and He Waka Eka Noa when it comes to sequestration, is we're going to say, actually, we're going to start with the principle that all scientifically valid forms of sequestration should be in the ETS. What would be a system that would enable that to occur? And at the moment, government, frankly, is something of a bottleneck. We weekly get letters and emails from people going, why can't I put mangroves in? Why can't I put soil sequestration in? Why can't I put magic seaweed in? Whatever. And we generally say, no, too hard, too complicated. Just go plant some trees. And so, which we need more of, by the way. Which is unsatisfactory answer for most people. What we're intending to do is to flip that on its head, or what we're proposing to do, because it is currently just a proposal, out for consultation, no final decisions, caveat, etc., is to say, well, actually, if you think that you can do the science over a sufficient time scale and geographic area to pass the threshold where, let's call it wetlands for the sake of argument, you can get wetlands into our national inventory, our national greenhouse gas inventory, because at the moment we use a set of proxy numbers, right? If you can get it to that standard, then it can go into the ETS. And then you get a return on your investment, right? But on doing the R&D. Now, I can foresee that there will be plenty of organisations out there that would be very keen to do the R&D on the basis that if I can get my wetlands or my mangroves or my riparian strips or whatever it is into that standard where it's internationally recognised, right? So it is a high bar, but if you can get it to that standard, then it's in, right? Third-party verified, and so on. And so then you've got an innovation system around natural sequestration and land-based sequestration and biology, most of which will be indigenous, right? Indigenous forms of sequestration. So that's the proposal. Now, we think that we can probably get that system up and running by 2025, but we can't get the first set of things that farmers want through that system by 2025, right? Because the amount of time it takes to do the work on that. So we are kind of saying, well, what might we do in the meantime to kind of tide people over until that first set of things comes through? And that's really the subject of the debate. Related to this is, as many of you have been around the conversation around the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, is the idea that we will create a biodiversity credits or biodiversity incentive system. And I am really excited about the possibility of this. And this could assist us with the economics of native forestry in the ETS, where we know that it is extremely hard to make that work at all. But if you can essentially create a stack where you get, your carbon credits for the slow growth indigenous forests, but on top of that you get biodiversity credits, then all of a sudden it starts to become competitive with other forms. And we also know that there is, certainly in the voluntary market internationally, there is a huge appetite for investment in restoring indigenous ecosystems, not just here in Aotearoa, but all over the world. There are some remarkable projects going on, and I think that we need to really unlock that through by essentially creating the conditions to allow that to occur. And so what I'm hoping to do is to twin that work with the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, because the much maligned significant natural area should be your top shelf single malt biodiversity unit, right? It's a clearly identified area of natural significance, remarkably. It's one of those few things in government that actually does what it says on the tin. And so the idea there is that you'd be able to say, well, look, this has got an official and premature, it's been identified by working with ecologists, working with iwi and so on, to say, well, no, that really is a very important area and it needs to be preserved and protected. It's kind of demarcated, you can map it and so on and so forth, which means it should be available for people to say, well, actually, I want to put something into protecting that and restoring that and so on. So I think that the combination there of what's going on in the National Policy Statement, which supports the Aotearoa New Zealand biodiversity strategy, with what we're doing with sequestration in He Waka Eke Noa and ETS reforms, all adds up to a pretty exciting picture of what the future could hold for how we protect and restore our landscapes. And there is an associated bit of work with this, which is in the budget we gave DOC, MPI and MFE a bit of money to look into some of these things initially for things like, again, wetlands research, a bit around what happens when what's the additional sequestration in an old growth native forest when you actively manage it for pests and so on and so forth. Forest and Bird did some pretty good starter for 10 work a couple of years ago, where they reckoned that if you were to permanently remove browsing pests from an old growth forest, that you could get about a 15% increase in the amount of carbon sequestered in that forest. Even if they're 50% wrong, a 7% additional sequestration effect in our native forests on, say, our conservation land would be an enormous additional carbon sink in our existing pre-1990 native forests, right? And again, that just becomes part of that picture. So I think that we need heaps of trees. I don't know if I mentioned that before. And I think that there is a really exciting moment that we're in. It is incredibly hard, right? We're as I'm sure you know, because you're all writing endless submissions for our endless rounds of consultation on all of these things. That there's kind of a jigsaw puzzle, and I'm trying to lay out all the different individual bits of the jigsaw puzzle, and what we're trying to do at the moment is to bring those together so you can actually see the picture that we're trying to create here. And I know it's hard work, and I thank you for your patience, and I thank you for the endless hours that you've been putting into those submissions and working with our officials, because I think we are reliant on all of you who are delving into several of these bits in your own work to be able to help to guide us towards a successful conclusion. And so I'm quite looking forward to the conversation that we're about to have. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
I really want to tell you to get really comfy because we're going to be here a while, but we actually don't have that much time. We've got a question so good we're going to ask it twice because we already asked it of Penny, but we're going to ask it of James as well. Thank you, John McCarthy. The Australian government has just agreed on a biodiversity credit. When will New Zealand get one?
Soon.
How soon?
Well, so when we finally gazette the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, in parallel to that, there's an implementation plan that takes place over many years. But the kind of first tranche of activity in that implementation plan is to put in place some of the conditions that enable biodiversity credits to occur. And in fact, these are already in the marketplace, right? Like people are already kind of doing different versions of this. It's a very, very new kind of space for Aotearoa to be in. So, I think it'll take time to kind of establish credibility and so on. And I think that there is a role that the government can and should play in terms of helping to underpin the kind of credibility and kind of consistency, because otherwise you just won't get much activity because people will be like, I'm not quite sure what I'm kind of getting involved in here. And because of some of the mess that we've had with the emissions trading scheme in previous decades, or the previous decade, that could kind of spoil the pooch if we get it wrong here as well. So those are kind of the conditions that we're trying to deal with. Yeah.
Are there any enablers to those conditions that this group can help with, or that you'd want to kind of, this group to remove some of those barriers with?
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
I have a list. Yeah. Well, we've got, first of all, go talk to Hayden. Hayden, just wait.
Hayden, stand up.
Yeah, so that's Hayden. Hayden's kind of been leading on this piece of work for us at MFE, and I think he's already in contact with many of the kind of people and organisations in the room. But we kind of need help with design, and we need a bit of help with understanding what is the role of government in this. And I'm pretty sure there is one, but you could take a sort of a minimalist or a maximalist approach, and probably the most effective thing to do will be somewhere in between. But we haven't really kind of gotten to that point. Yeah.
Got another question here, which I love. Will there be government-based incentives for plant nurseries in order to increase the ability for the heap of trees? Presently, native plant nurseries are barely economically viable.
Stuart.nash@parliament.govt.nz.
Do you have his mobile number? I feel like that'd be faster. Yeah.
So the answer, that really does, the reason I'm saying that, I know I'm being facetious, but that does fall within the Minister for Forestry's responsibilities rather than mine. I know it's been talked about. I don't know where it's at.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Got a question just come through, Nick. What?
Sorry, there is the one thing I will say is, I think that we unnecessarily subsidise things quite a lot of the time. And if you knew that there was going to be a pipeline of planting, so you had a customer for native seedlings, I think that the current economics of those would sort themselves out, actually, because part of the reason why they're barely economic is because they're start-stop, uneven customers, the price is kind of thin and so on. But if you knew that we were going to need X 100,000 hectares of permanent indigenous forest, and you had some idea of where those were, and you kind of knew who the kind of buyer was who was doing the planting, then I think that people would I think that the economics of that would shift pretty quickly. Yeah.
James, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for joining us.